Hi, everyone. Welcome to Period 3 Review, Part 2. This part is taking place at Mount Vernon, which was the historical home of George and Martha Washington. And we're here because we are picking up the Period 3 review with the Washington presidency. So, once we created our new constitution, we established an executive branch so that we would have someone to be kind of the overall leader of the country. And George Washington kind of reluctantly accepts the position for everyone else. It was pretty much a given that he would be the guy for the job after his leadership of the Continental Army during the Revolution. And he's going to have the big role of kind of establishing what the presidency should be and what being the president is like. So he's going to set multiple important precedents or examples that other people will follow. And of course, the first is going to be being a war hero, which for a while is something that people really look for in a future presidential candidate, and even something that we still respect today. A second of his precedents is going to be establishing a cabinet, so a group of advisors who will help him to make decisions. Since the president can't really be expected to be an expert on everything, he will have people who will consult with him and tell him what they think he should do. And George Washington may have possibly regretted that when he chose two people who were very at odds during this time period to be on his cabinet. And those two people were, of course, Alexander Hamilton, the leader of the Federalists, who became the Secretary of the Treasury, and then Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the Anti Federalists, who became the Secretary of State. And throughout Washington's presidency, he's going to have to negotiate several conflicts between them. Those conflicts boiled down to really the people that these two guys represented. For Alexander Hamilton, his Federalists tended to be people who were more often from the North, who were typically wealthier, who were business people. And for Thomas Jefferson, the people who he represented tended to be from the South. They were farmers, and many of them were slaveholders. So those two groups of people certainly have different interests and needs, and those will be reflected on the ideas and policies that Hamilton and Jefferson promote. And the basic difference between them is their philosophy on how the Constitution should be interpreted. For Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, they believed that the Constitution was up for interpretation. They believed in a loose interpretation, and that leads to the use of things like the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause, which says that, the government can use their power as they see fit when there is not a specific explanation of their power in the Constitution, and they can kind of take powers that they are granted and stretch them to include other powers that they see as necessary. For Thomas Jefferson and his Anti Federalists, they believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, meaning that only what is written in the Constitution should be followed. Only those powers granted to the government that are specifically listed should be granted to the government. So those things will come into question several times throughout Washington's presidency and even today. One issue that comes about is an economic policy that's going to be promoted by Alexander Hamilton, and that's going to be the Assumption Plan. You guys might remember that some states, especially those in the North, had created a considerable amount of debt that we were trying to pay off because, we didn't look very solidly founded by the countries that we owed money to. And so Alexander Hamilton wanted to take care of that debt to make us more trustworthy. So a lot of southern states viewed that as a problem just for the North because they didn't have that debt. So Alexander and Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson are going to be at odds over Hamilton's assumption plan, which went like this. Basically, the federal government would take on or assume the debts of all of the states and then use taxes to pay off that debt. You guys might remember when I initially talked to you about this, I went around the room, asked everyone for the number, added that up, and then said that I was going to divide that among you evenly for taxation. Those of you who had given me very small numbers didn't think that was fair because you were going to end up paying much more than you actually owed. That was how the South felt about it. We also listened to that cabinet rap battle from Hamilton that presented some of the same ideas, that the South didn't feel that they should have to take on the North's debts, but then also the North's idea that all of the labor that was being done in the South was done by slaves, and there was a little bit of hypocrisy involved in that. So this is one issue that Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson are going to take on, and that will be followed by also the creation of the national bank, because if the government's going to be dealing in so much money and paying off debts and loans and stuff like that, they need some power to control a bank as well. So that will also be an issue in question. Another issue that Washington has to deal with in his presidency is going to be the Whiskey Rebellion. And this is probably going to be the most important domestic issue that we have at the time, because it's going to show us something about our country that's really crucial. So the Whiskey Rebellion comes about because we had decided to place a tax on whiskey, and a lot of people were upset about that, especially our farmers who, if they grew grains, making whiskey was a good way to preserve anything extra left over so that it didn't go bad. And also whiskey was, something that people drank pretty often. We talked in class about how sometimes it was a better alternative to other things like water and milk because the whiskey was always going to be safe. So people would water it down and drink it a lot, very often. So this taxation is something that a lot of people are opposed to. Again, they're thinking back to this revolution that we just fought. And one reason why we fought that was because we were mad about taxes. And we have a brand new president, and here he goes with more taxes. So people didn't respond very well, and they started doing really horrible things to the tax collectors who came out to try to handle that business, and they started to rebel. And Washington knows that he has to do something about this, and so he dispatches the national troops to take care of it, and they're able to put down the rebellion. This is important because if you remember back to Shays' Rebellion, which I mentioned in the part 1 edition of this video, then with Shays' Rebellion, the government couldn't do anything about the rebellion. Now with the Whiskey Rebellion, they can. So this shows that our new federal government, our new constitution, is strong enough to create a nation that can handle those issues that arise. So we are now finally on a more solid path to establishing the government and the democracy that we had wanted. Another thing that Washington tackles is kind of the building up of the judicial branch. We had established a judicial branch, but we needed to kind of build up all of the different districts and the different jobs of the different levels of the judiciary branch. So that will be clarified under Washington's presidency as well. Finally, moving on to some foreign policy. Even though we had fought a war and become independent from Britain, our problems with Britain were not over yet. We had a lot of issues with the British, especially at sea, and something called impressments that you might remember. They would stop our ships, they would confiscate our cargo, and they would even take sailors and force them into the British Navy. So Washington sends one of his representatives, John Jay, to try to handle this situation. And John Jay is going to sign a treaty, Jay's Treaty, to try to avoid war with Britain. And it doesn't really work out the way that people had hoped. He makes a lot of concessions to the British instead of just getting them to bow to our wishes as people had hoped. But he does manage to avoid war through the agreements that he makes. But that's going to be something that comes up again later on as we get into John Adams' presidency. Now, the last thing that I'll say about George Washington for now is that as his second term comes to an end, he sets another precedent, which is simply stepping away from the presidency after the second term. There were no term limits at this time, but he, wanted to make sure that people remembered that the president was not a king. They were not supposed to have power for life. Washington was getting older. He didn't want to die in office. And to be honest, he was also just kind of done with his service to the country. He had been, fighting for the country and leading the country for quite a while now. And as he falls into his old age, he wants to return to this lovely Mount Vernon and live out the rest of his days in peace. And so that's what he does. And he's going to set that precedent of serving 2 terms only, which people will follow until Franklin Roosevelt, who serves more than his 2 terms, and then we'll have the addition of the 22nd Amendment that places the limitations on the terms. So, as Washington exits office, he leaves the United States with a farewell address, which he fills with advice to us. And of course, it's advice that we don't listen to very well. One thing that he tells us to do is to avoid political parties. Washington had not claimed a party, although we would consider him a Federalist. And of course, he knew that the Federalists and the Anti Federalists had already emerged, but he was pointing out the fact that that really hadn't done anything for us. In his eyes, that had just created more conflict and more trouble than anything else. So he was encouraging people to unite together. Along those same lines, he also told us to avoid sectionalism, so that conflict between the North and South. Even though we weren't like on the verge of civil war or anything like that, it was obvious that since the times of the colonies, the New England and the Southern colonies had developed very differently, and they were on very different paths with different interests and different goals. And he knew that that could potentially be a problem. Boy, oh boy, was it. Finally, he also warned against foreign alliances and encouraged us to be neutral. We try to do that a little bit for a little while, but that very quickly fades away and leads us into a lot more trouble too. As Washington leaves office, he's going to be replaced by by a fellow Federalist. This is a person who claims the Federalist ideas, and that's going to be John Adams. As you guys probably remember, John Adams wasn't a super popular president, and we don't remember him for a lot of huge accomplishments. Part of that was because of his own personal flaws. He was a very excuse me, it's not Corona, I promise. He was a very paranoid person, and that was reflected in some of the policies and things that he made. He also was just very different from George Washington. George Washington was this kind of charismatic, elegant leader. The women said he was good looking. People wanted to spend time around him. They were charmed by him. And John Adams just wasn't that. So his presidency is not going to be exactly what he probably would have hoped for. And it's going to be marked by two big things that we talked about. And if you want more details, you can always look back in your notes. There's a page on Adams' presidency that has both of these things in it. One of them is the Alien and Sedition Acts. That is going to be designed to protect the power and the reputation of the Federalist Party, but at the expense of people's First Amendment rights. The Alien and Sedition Act said that if you criticized the government in any way, you could be punished in a variety of ways, maybe fined, maybe put in jail, and if you were a recent immigrant to the United States, maybe deported. It also lengthened the amount of time necessary to become a citizen of the United States, and people felt that this was a violation of the Constitution. Especially our anti-federalists were quite alarmed by this, because this is what they had feared all along, that our Constitution wouldn't be strong enough to protect people's rights, and that some tyrant of a president would come over and basically become just like a king and take away all of the rights that people had had. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are going to kind of spring into action to respond to the Alien and Sedition Acts. They're going to write the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And in those Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, they're going to establish the idea of nullification, or the right of the states to ignore federal law and do what they think is best for their state. This is not only important at this time, but of course, it will set a precedent in the future for things like the nullification crisis under Andrew Jackson, and then, of course, secession leading up to the Civil War. So this is going to be a pretty important document to be written at this time. Another thing that John Adams has on his list of not so great things in his presidency was the XYZ affair, and this is going to be kind of a scandal from our interactions with the French. The French were also giving us trouble at sea, and because of agreements that we made with Britain, we were kind of trapped in this entangled mess, and we tried to make an agreement with the French. But the French ambassadors that our guys met with tried to get a bribe from our delegates in order to, pass along communications to the people who were really in charge. And our ambassadors are offended. When the American people find out about it, they're offended. And we're kind of on the edge of war with France. We enter into this quasi-war where we're not quite at war, but we could be at any moment. So one thing that you could say about John Adams was that he did keep us out of this war with France, which could have been unfortunate for us at the time. Anyway, John Adams' presidency is short-lived, and in the election of 1800, he will not be reelected. He is instead going to be replaced by Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson is, of course, the leader of the Anti-Federalists, or the Democratic Republicans. And so this election of 1800 is going to be known as a revolution, a dramatic change, because power is changing hands. And this, again, is something that shows us kind of the power and the success of our democracy at this time, even though it wasn't perfect. Still, we have slaves. Still, we have women who can't vote. Still, we're treating the Native Americans terribly. Democracy is not perfect, but it works for the purposes that we have at this time, because there's no revolution, no actual fighting, no war, no chaos that ensues from the election of a president from a different party. And, for years and years throughout the world, that had been the case when power changed hands. So the Revolution of 1800, or the election of 1800, will show us that we can do this successfully and that our democracy is working. And that brings us to the end of period 3. So be on the lookout for a period 4 review later. Bye.